Did early Canadians really commit genocide? Well, the Prime Minister seems to think so. I'm Candice Malcolm, and this is The Candice Malcolm Show. Hi everyone, thank you so much for tuning in today. I want to do a little bit of a deep dive today and talk about a word that gets thrown around an awful lot. And as you know, it's become incredibly fashionable to throw around the term genocide. We hear it all the time from politicians on the left.
As I said, we accept those findings. We accept the finding that this was genocide.
This mass grave is a painful reminder of the genocide.
In the buzzword of the day, assimilation. In the language of the 21st century, cultural genocide.
We call this genocide.
The horrifying revelation of the 215 children found at Kamloops residential school makes clear Canada has committed genocide against Indigenous peoples.
I've said before that the residential schools was a genocide of our people.
Canada committed deliberate race, identity, and gender-based genocide against Indigenous people.
But is it really true? Did Canada really commit genocide? Not too long ago, the answer from the perspective of international law was no. In fact, it used to be shocking to hear this phrase uttered in the Canadian context, and international scholars and legal experts used to urge caution with such a loaded and political word. Canada's early history is filled with brutality and hardship, there's no doubt about it. The 18th and 19th centuries were defined by wars, atrocity, constant fighting, constant killing over land and resources, and Canada was no different. But suddenly, all of the context has been stripped away, and we now look at events of the past and judge them as if they were being carried out today, as if they were being carried out right now. And as for the most loaded political term of all, genocide, it gets thrown around now, basically meaning something bad that happened in the past. This latest frenzy all began in Kamloops with the accusation of mass and unmarked graves. Well, on Thursday, the Kamloops Indian Band finally presented its research on the 215 unmarked graves announced earlier this spring. The presentation was pretty unremarkable, at least from a media perspective. It was filled with all the ceremonial elements that you would expect, and lots of excessive political statements in Orwellian language that was frankly a little bit surprising. We heard from 3 scientists, each of whom emphasized emotion over facts and politics over science, using the podium to virtue signal about the need for more apologies, more shame, more contrition from Canadians, and more money to First Nations. And as for the research that led to discovery, my suspicions were more or less confirmed. The radar technology is not very accurate and not very precise. In fact, we learned that the 215 figure that has been repeated millions of times around the world is not accurate. The real number is more like 200. I say more like 200 because the number itself is an estimate. It's not an exact science. It's based on the number of disturbances detected in the ground. This is what the technology detects. And as you can see, we're not looking at an X-ray machine that detects bones or human remains. That's sort of what the media implied, but that's certainly not what we saw. It's certainly nothing that could determine whether these graves belong to children or adults, First Nations, or pupils at a school. We're only seeing places where the soil has moved. But these are mere facts, and facts are not as important as narrative. That is why I want to bring to your attention a speech that was given during this media presentation in Kamloops. After the main event was over, so after we heard from the chief, a language specialist, 3 scientists, and 3 former students of the school, a politician took the stage. This is Roseanne Archibald, the very recently elected chief of the Assembly of First Nations, the AFN. This is the highest ranking political position that is always held by a First Nations leader in Canada. So after we learned that the real number of unmarked graves was more like 200 and not 215, Archibald said this.
Here in Tishkwetmik territory, in these sacred lands, Canadians and the world first learned about how 215 innocent children died and were buried in unmarked graves. This is a crime against humanity. This is a crime against little children.
So just moments after we heard a researcher say that the number of the remains is suspected to be 200 and that there is no way to confirm whether these remains are actually there and who they belong to, this politician jumps up and repeats the narrative with no regard for facts, no regard for truth. Without any hint of self-awareness or any regard for being a responsible leader to her community, she goes ahead and pours gasoline on the fire. She's standing on the graves of dead children, children who died more than 100 years ago, possibly even longer, possibly not even children or First Nations children, and she declares that she has proof of crimes against humanity. But it gets worse. This is what she says next.
The United Nations has called this genocide. We call this genocide. This ground-penetrating radar technology is revealing evidence, undisputable proof that crimes were committed.
Wait, what? She says that the United Nations has called this genocide? But is that even true? Let me be clear, this is an incredible accusation to make. It's a shocking statement, and yet no one really batted an eye at it. The media didn't cover it, despite the fact that hundreds of journalists were watching the speech. Did anyone bother to fact-check the statement? Did anyone ask a simple question? What do you mean the United Nations called this genocide? When? Where? It's worth spending a little bit of time talking about this word genocide, because it just gets thrown around so much today. But I think it's worthwhile to talk about why it is incorrect to use it in the context of unmarked graves found near residential schools. This is from the United Nations Office on Genocide Prevention and the Responsibility to Protect. It talks about the history of the word and what it means. So here we go. The word genocide was first coined by Polish lawyer Raphael Lemkin in 1944 in his book Axis Rule in Occupied Europe. It consists of the Greek prefix genos, meaning race or tribe, and the Latin suffix cide, meaning killing. Lemkin developed the term partly in response to the Nazi policy of systematic murder of Jewish people during the Holocaust, but also in response to previous instances in history of targeted actions aimed at the destruction of particular groups of people. So in other words, the international community was so horrified by the systematic way that Nazis murdered Jews. They murdered millions of Jews in concentration camps and gas chambers. It was so chilling and so atrocious that we literally created a new word to describe the horror. It wasn't just an act of war. It wasn't just a familiar story of the time where one nation attacks another, pillages and kills and takes their land. What the Nazis did was far worse. They intentionally and deliberately tried to destroy the Jewish race by murdering all Jews. This is the origin of the word genocide, meaning to wipe out an entire race of people by murdering them all. Now, according to the definition of what constitutes genocide, according to international legal definitions laid out in the Genocide Convention, there must be two main elements in order to constitute genocide. There must be a mental element and there must be a physical element. So let me read a little bit more from the United Nations definition. So first, the mental element. The mental element is the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such, and also to the physical element. The physical element includes the following 5 acts, so it has to include all 5 of these things. Killing members of a group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. So those are the elements that all must be there in order to call something genocide. People try to argue that that last bit, forcibly transferring children, is what happened in residential schools and therefore it's genocide. But keep in mind, you have to have done all of these things, not just one of them, but all of them. So I'll just continue to read. The intent is the most difficult element to determine. To constitute genocide, there must be a proven intent on the part of the perpetrators to physically destroy a nation, ethnical, racial, or religious group. Cultural destruction does not suffice, nor does an intent to simply disperse a group. This is a special intent that makes the crime of genocide so unique. So did you catch that last sentence about cultural destruction? In other words, there's no such thing as cultural genocide. The term genocide shouldn't be watered down with qualifiers. Just like you can't culturally murder someone, you cannot commit cultural genocide. We already have another term that's used for stripping away culture. It's called assimilation. Now, maybe we should come up with an even stronger word than that, but right now that's the word that we have, assimilation. And it is not the same thing as mass murdering with the intent to wipe out an entire group. Those are not the same thing. Now, not too long ago, this all was common sense. Just take a look at this Globe and Mail article from 2015. The headline reads, Chief Justice says Canada attempted cultural genocide on Aboriginals. Now first, notice how cultural genocide is in quotations, and that's because at the time when it was used, it wasn't really thought to be a real thing. I'll just read the first few lines of the article so you get a feel for how the term was used at the time. Supreme Court Chief Justice Beverley McLachlin says Canada attempted to commit cultural genocide against Aboriginal people in what she calls the worst stain on Canada's human rights record. Genocide, an attempt to destroy a people in whole or part, is a crime under international law. The United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, adopted in 1948, does not use the phrase cultural genocide, but says genocide may include serious mental harm to a group. Chief Justice McLachlin appears to be the highest-ranking Canadian official to use the phrase. Former Liberal Prime Minister Paul Martin used it 2 years ago in describing residential schools for Aboriginal children when he testified before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission set up by the Conservative government. So that was all from the Globe and Mail report. And keep in mind, the Globe and Mail report is no right-wing publication. It's probably center-left. It's more accurate. But just 6 years ago, using this term in this context was considered a little shocking and a little silly. But now today, it gets thrown around everywhere, and even without that qualifier, without saying cultural genocide. That's quite the leap to make. And despite what the AFN chief says, the United Nations has not, in fact, declared or named this genocide. Now, I'll just say this, I don't hold the United Nations in very high regard. It's a highly corrupt organization that frankly has no moral high ground. It allows flagrant human rights abusers to chair committees on human rights, it gives mass murderers and dictators a platform to spew their lies, and it allows evil and corrupt leaders equal standing to liberal democracies. It's a farce. And I say this as someone who studied international relations and international law in grad school and who has participated in UN summits and conferences. But just look at the way that the United Nations covered the story in Kamloops. This is a headline from the United Nations. It says, Canada, UN independent experts call for full-fledged investigations into mass grave at Indigenous school. Now, as you know, there was no mass grave. That was a word that was thrown around irresponsibly and recklessly by the legacy media and apparently by the United Nations as well. The chiefs of the bands that had made the revelations, made the announcements about the unmarked graves, have had to come forth and clarify that these are not mass graves. But that doesn't matter. The UN is still throwing it around. Of course, words do matter, and the UN throwing out incorrect and politically loaded propaganda is in and of itself self-indicting. But even the corrupt UN has not gone so far as to say the residential schools constitute genocide. Nowhere could we at True North find any time that the UN has uttered the word genocide in connection to residential schools. Nowhere have they made that accusation. They haven't because it wasn't. There was no intent to wipe out an entire people. Quite the opposite. The intent of residential schools, as best we could tell, was to help, to lift a community out of poverty, to help them succeed in an industrializing society, and to give them an opportunity with education. Now, you could rightly argue that the policy was an abject failure. That's also true. And it's true that horrible, unspeakable crimes were committed at these residential schools. But as we know, intent matters, and all crimes do not equate to the very worst crime imaginable. So while residential schools have never been determined to be genocide by the UN, interestingly, while I was fact-checking the statement, I was probably the only journalist in the country that was bothering to fact-check this politician. When I was fact-checking, though, I did stumble upon the UN talking about genocide in the Canadian context. So in 2019, the highly politicized National Inquiry for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls put out their report, and they called these murders genocide. Now, I could do an entire show on this ridiculous inquiry, the extreme political bias, the over-the-top ideology that led the research, the endless flaws in their approach, and perhaps one day I will do a show on that point, but for today I'll just say a few things. So the commission, which was given a mandate and some $92 million in funding by the Trudeau government back in 2015, comprised of just 4 people. 4 far-left lawyers and activists who spun the truth, stuffed it full of hyperbole and ideological rhetoric, and concluded that murdered Indigenous women amounted to genocide. Now, keep in mind that a few years earlier, in 2014 and 2015, the RCMP did their own report on the same issue on the missing and murdered Aboriginal women, and I read both reports. The facts are truly troubling. First Nations women in Canada are murdered at a much higher rate than non-Indigenous women, up to 6 times more. Now that, of course, is a problem. It's incredibly sad, and more should be done to address this problem. Now, interestingly, this is what the RCMP said about the deaths that they analyzed. This is a quote from that 2015 RCMP report. The consolidated data from nearly 300 contributing police agencies have confirmed that 70% of the offenders were of Aboriginal origin, 25% were non-Aboriginal, 5% were unknown ethnicity. However, it is not ethnicity of the offender that is relevant, but rather the relationship between the victim and the offender that guides our focus with respect to prevention. Aboriginal females were killed by a spouse, family member, or intimate relation in 62% of the cases. Now, the national inquiry under Trudeau did not include these sorts of statistics, and they contend that 70% figure. They say that that is not true. The 2019 report flat out states that the 70% figure is wrong, while it did not provide another figure to counter that with. Now, interestingly, when the RCMP was studying the issue, they were looking at a much smaller pool of cases. So according to the Native Women's Association of Canada's national database, from 1960 to 2010, there were 582 missing and murdered Indigenous women. And yet, when the National Inquiry released its 2019 report, they pegged the number at almost 10 times higher, stating that there were roughly 4,000 murders that they analyzed. Now, they didn't provide an exact number, and they didn't provide any data on the ethnicity of the murderers. So how did they land on that conclusion of genocide? Well, this is from a CBC report at the time. It says, the report concludes that a genocide driven by the disproportionate level of violence faced by Indigenous women and girls occurred in Canada through state actions and inactions rooted in colonialism and colonial ideologies. I'll continue from the report just so you get a little taste of the ideology that I'm talking about. It says, we do know that thousands of Indigenous women, girls, and 2SLGBTQQIA, and that stands for Two-Spirit, Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Transgender, Queer, Questioning, Intersex, and Asexual, have been lost to the Canadian genocide to date. The fact that First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples are still here and that the population is growing should not discount the charge of genocide. So even though we don't know who carried out this violence, the report never says, the mere disproportionality and the history of colonialism equates to genocide, we're told by this report. And who is to blame? Who exactly carried out this genocide, since the murdered women were murdered by individuals, not by the government or on behalf of the government? This is how the Commission circled that square. Canada's Crimes Against Humanity and War Crimes Act, passed in 2000, offers a broad definition, saying genocide can encompass not only acts of commission, but also acts of omission. You get that? They've expanded the definition so broadly that it no longer just includes deliberate acts to destroy a group of people. It now also includes acts of omission, meaning the failure of the RCMP to proactively stop murders within First Nations communities constitutes genocide. Now that, in and of itself, should be shocking. But perhaps most shocking of all is the fact that the Prime Minister of Canada conceded this point. So here it is. The Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, accepting the findings of that radical report, stating that the disproportionate murder rate of Indigenous women in Canada, in Canadian society today, not 150 years ago, but today, amounts to genocide.
As I said, we accept those findings. We accept the finding that this was genocide.
Folks, we live in a world where facts don't matter, where the meaning of words can change to fit a political narrative, and where the grievances never end. I'm Candice Malcolm, and this is The Candice Malcolm Show.